Hello, and welcome to the OCO Roundtable podcast. From Oraro & Company Advocates, my name is Melanie Mwenda, and I am your host today. I have the pleasure of hosting Jacob Ochieng and Natalie Obago, who are part of the firm's data protection team. Jacob is a partner in the corporate and commercial practice group. With over 12 years' experience, he has advised both local and international corporates on commercial contracts, corporate advisory, corporate restructuring, mergers and acquisitions, privatizations, and infrastructure projects. Welcome, Jacob.
Thank you, Melanie, for having me.
Natalie is an associate in the firm's dispute resolution practice group, and she specializes in general contractual disputes, employment and labor law, land disputes, insurance law, data protection law, product liability disputes, and constitutional law. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you for having me, Melanie.
So the concept of data protection by design and default has gained importance over the years, with more and more countries requiring data handlers, that is data processors and controllers, to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to promote data privacy rights. In today's episode, our speakers will take us through how organizations can create a more privacy-centric culture by adopting the data protection by design and data protection by default principles. So let's kick off with you, Natalie. Can you tell our listeners more about what privacy centricity entails?
Thank you for that question, Melanie. With privacy centricity, data protection is at the forefront of the marketing and business strategies. So what that means is that throughout the life cycle of personal data, the organization makes sure that in its design, in its architecture of the systems, in the product making, privacy is at the forefront, as I've said. And so that means the organization has made a commitment to adopt strong privacy measures that protect personal data at all times. In episode 1, we talk about the first 100 days of a data protection officer's role. And we talk about how it is important for the data protection officer to get stakeholder buy-in, that is from critical departments within the organization. And this is one way of creating a privacy-centric culture within the organization. Because you see what happens if the stakeholders have bought into the privacy culture narrative, they're able to break barriers around privacy protection. With privacy centricity, an organization needs to recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all. These organizations have to tailor-make the technical and organizational measures to suit their specific needs at any given time. Just some historical tidbits. The concept of privacy by design was initially coined by the former Privacy Commissioner of Ontario in 1995, that is Anne Kovokian. She believed that privacy needs to be built into the day-to-day operations of an organization. In 2010, the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners recognized the concept as an essential component of fundamental privacy protection. So as our listeners will see, the concept of data protection by design and default is not a new concept. The only difference now is that this concept has been codified. For instance, in Kenya, Sections 41 and 42 of the Data Protection Act prescribe how data handlers can promote data protection by design and default, which is what Jacob will take us through.
Thank you for that introduction, Natalie. That was quite insightful. Now, Jacob, taking it up from where Natalie has left it off, tell us more about what the Data Protection Act actually provides with regards to data protection by design and by default.
Thank you, Melanie, for that question. In respect of data protection by design, Section 41 of the Data Protection Act requires that a data controller or processor implements appropriate technical and organizational measures which are designed to achieve two objectives. First one is to implement data protection principles in an effective manner, and secondly, to integrate necessary safeguards into the processing. What this means is that data privacy should be given a key consideration at the time of making the decision or implementing the project, as well as at the time of actual processing of the data. Therefore, the duty applies both at the time of determining the means of processing the data and at the actual time of processing. As the Information and Commissioner's Office of the UK puts it, data protection must be baked into the data processing and business activities of the organization. Now, for data protection by default, the Data Protection Act requires every data handler, that is the data processor and data controller, to implement appropriate technical and organization measures to ensure that by default, only personal data which is necessary for each specific purpose is processed. This concept espouses two data protection principles. That is, data minimization and purpose limitation. This means that an organization should only process the personal data that is necessary to achieve its specific purpose. In order to achieve data minimization, personal data must be adequate, relevant, limited to what is necessary in relation to the purpose for which it is processed. This means that the data handler should only process personal data that is necessary and relevant for a specific purpose. An organization that wishes to obtain personal data from a data subject must, in this case, interrogate and carry out an assessment before obtaining data from a customer or from its clients or from a data subject to ensure that that data that it obtains is necessary for the purpose. On the other hand, purpose limitation principle requires that personal data must be collected for an explicit, specified, and legitimate purpose and not further processed in a manner incompatible with those purposes. So before collecting data, you must establish, why am I obtaining this data and for what purpose? Once you've made that determination as an organization, that data must only be used for that specific purpose and not any other. In the event that organization desires to use that data for any other purpose, then it must obtain further consent from the data subject. A good example here is a bank that obtains personal data from a data subject for purposes of processing loans. Now, the bank cannot use that data for purposes of marketing. Should it wish to use that data for marketing, it needs to obtain further consent from the data subject in relation to that specific purpose. Section 41 of the Data Protection Act provides some guidance on the measures that an organization can take in order to ensure that it complies with data protection by design and by default. I'll just highlight a few of them. The first one, an organization is required to identify any foreseeable risks to personal data before it engages in any activity that has a bearing on personal data. Once it identifies the risks, it is required to implement measures or safeguards that will mitigate or eliminate altogether the identified risks. The other thing that it can consider is to pseudonymize or encrypt the personal data so that it's not accessible to any person that does not need it, or even if there's a breach, the third party do not have access and cannot be able to view or read that data. The other thing the organization can consider is to restore availability of that data in a timely manner in the event that that data is breached or is no longer available because of a breach. The other safeguard is to ensure that an organization on an ongoing basis verifies the safeguards and implements them in an effective manner. The last thing that an organization can consider is to ensure that the safeguards that it has put in place, as discussed above, are continually verified and updated in response to any new risks or deficiencies. In terms of responsibility, a data controller is primarily responsible for complying with the data protection by design and by default as a principle. However, if it engages a data processor, then it is incumbent upon the data controller to ensure that the data processor that it engages complies with these principles as well. In terms of its employees, the law requires the data controller to ensure that only those employees that have authority have access to that data, and then that the employees comply with the relevant organizational and technical measures that the data controller has put in place. Now, if you look at the Data Protection General Regulation 2021, Part 5 set out some elements that an organization can consider in putting in place its organization technical measures to safeguard personal data of its data subjects. These are elements or measures that an organization can consider and find out which safeguards are applicable to it and implement them in order to demonstrate compliance with the data protection by design and by default. They are quite instrumental, and organizations should consider on a case-by-case basis which principles or elements it can apply in order to safeguard the personal data it collects from its data subjects. In a nutshell, really what you're saying, Melanie, is that whenever an organization is initiating any activity, and activity in this case could be launching a new product or a new service or coming up with a new IT system that has a bearing or implication on personal data, it needs to carry out what we call a personal data risk assessment to identify what are the potential risks associated with that product, that service, or that system, and put in place relevant, appropriate measures from a technical perspective and from a policy perspective to ensure that that data is safeguarded and protected from breach.
Thank you for that, Jacob. We have gone through what the Data Protection Act basically requires of organizations to ensure that they have systems in place that ensure and promote privacy by design and by default. Now, Natalie, can you elucidate further on how organizations and our listeners at large can ensure that they promote privacy by design and by default?
Certainly, Melanie. The Information Privacy Commissioner of Ontario has developed 7 foundational principles or pillars that organizations can use or can rely on to implement data protection by design and by default. So these are certain fundamental considerations that organizations can apply whenever they are asking themselves, okay, how do we promote data protection by design or by default? So one would be proactivity and not reactivity when it comes to data protection by design or by default. So they need to think to themselves, how do we prevent data breaches from occurring rather than how do we now address a data breach once it's occurred? They need to think about incorporating privacy mechanisms from the get-go, which will ensure that they have a more effective system of handling personal data and rather protecting personal data. Organizations need to think about privacy as a default setting. Jacob has taken us through the technical and organizational measures and what they mean. Organizations need to think about these measures as a fallback plan. So what this means is that organizations need to put in systems that are built in a manner that don't require human intervention to promote protection of personal data. The third foundational principle is privacy embedded into the design. So for organizations, it needs to be clear that privacy was the emphasis and the focus during the design and the implementation of any system. This ensures that privacy protections are intertwined with the core functionality of that product, of that service, or whatever it is that the organization is offering. The fourth pillar is full functionality. Whereas privacy ought to be emphasized, an organization cannot forego the system's functionality for the sake of privacy and vice versa. So it's an intricate balance to ensure that the organization is able to benefit both from privacy protections and also ensuring that it achieves its bottom line. Next, we have end-to-end security, or what some people call full lifecycle protection. And this means that the data handler needs to think about how they can protect personal data from the minute they collect it throughout the time they are using the personal data, they're disclosing it, and so on and so forth, until they destroy the same or until the very last stage when they're dealing with personal data. This pillar is cognizant of the fact that personal data is vulnerable at any stage of the personal data's life cycle. And so protections need to be afforded to that personal data at all stages. The next thing we have is visibility and transparency. And what will become apparent throughout this series is that the Data Protection Act basically seeks to ensure that data subjects have control over their data. And how do we ensure this? We give them visibility over the data processes in respect of their personal data. They are aware and in the know throughout the life cycle of personal data. Next, we have user centricity. Whenever the organization is thinking about how it will deal with personal data or how it will interact with personal data, it needs to think about the user and center that user throughout these processes.
Thank you, Natalie. Now we've talked a lot about privacy by design and privacy by default. Jacob, probably you can provide our listeners with a comparison of what these two concepts are.
Certainly, Melanie. For purposes of today's episode, I'll look at 3 differences between these concepts from a technical perspective. The first difference is the implementation focus. For data protection by design, the privacy features are integrated into the fabric of the system from the onset. So what this means that at the time of designing the system is built with data privacy in mind. On the other hand, data protection by default ensures that privacy protections without user intervention. This means, for instance, that a system is built in such a manner that only those who have access or those who need that information have access to it, and there are appropriate authentication requirements prior to access of that data, so that no one other than those who need to know that information have access to that information. The other difference is with regard to the timing of implementation. Data protection by default features are activated post the design of the system, meaning that when the system is operational, its configurations are privacy-centric. Take an example of an office that is installing a new security system. A data protection by default feature would log a user out of the system after every interval of, say, 3 to 4 hours. That's an example of a data protection by default feature. On the other hand, data protection by design is adopted and instituted at the time of designing the system. Using the same example I've given, data protection by design would ensure that the system is designed in such a manner that any data that is obtained through that security feature is either pseudonymized or anonymized or encrypted to ensure that no third party who do not need that information have access to it. The third difference is with regard to the scope of application. For data protection by design, the safeguards are embedded into every single step of the structure of the system. This means that the system is designed in such a manner that data is protected from the onset. That is, from the time that data is obtained, recorded in the system, and finally removed from the system. However, data protection by default focuses exclusively and narrowly on the controls and the settings that are inbuilt in the system. Those settings and controls should be designed in such a manner that they promote data protection and privacy, and they cannot be used for purposes of undermining the data privacy of the data subjects.
Now, Natalie and Jacob, probably you can also shed more light on what would be the benefits to an organization in ensuring that they build a privacy-centric culture.
I think for one, Melanie, would be that the business would have stability. When the business has put in place technical and organizational measures to protect personal data, they are unlikely to have interruptions in the case of data breaches and so on and so forth. And these safeguards that they implement and the measures that they implement will allow the business to focus on its core functions. The other thing is enhanced customer trust. We've talked about visibility and transparency with data subjects. And so when an organization has technical and organizational measures that the customers can see and be like, okay, you know what, my data is protected. This builds better trust, better relationships between the organization and their customers. The next thing is regulatory compliance. I mean, we have the Data Protection Act and its regulations. The basic thing the technical and organizational measures will do is ensure compliance. Less interactions, or rather, not interactions per se, but less friction between the organization and the authorities that promote protection of personal data. And that's basically the essence of data protection.
Of course, the other benefit of building a privacy-centric culture is that organizations are able to operate at minimal costs or at reduced costs. This is because an organization that has put in place safeguards and appropriate measures to prevent data breaches are able to operate without the fear of sanctions and penalties under the Data Protection Act and the relevant legislation. And therefore, an organization is able to operate smoothly without any, unreasonable risks associated with data breach. For purposes of today's episode, the last but not the least benefit of building a privacy-centric culture is better brand reputation. Of course, an organization that has better data protection privacy controls is regarded highly in the market. And as you see in the recent past, most organizations are actually emphasizing that they're only willing to do business with companies that have put in place safeguards and measures to ensure that their data is safeguarded. And therefore, an organization that has better measures are likely to attract brand reputation, which is a very key tool or asset for an organization. To conclude our discussion today, in this digital age where data is a valuable asset, it is important for organizations to prioritize privacy centricity. This ensures that the organization reaps the benefits of a privacy-centric culture, as we've discussed, and also ensures that the business is able to operate without any interruptions. This is very key for organizations, and we would encourage our listeners and organizations to ensure that they consider this as part of their key considerations in implementing any product, any service, or any IT systems within the organizations.
Thank you, Jacob and Natalie. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to the second episode in our data protection series. Stay tuned for our next episodes, where we'll continue discussing essential topics in data privacy. We value your feedback, and thus, we encourage you to reach out to us on our social media channels using the hashtag OCO Roundtable. Until then, goodbye and take care.